Good morning, dear friends. Today is Sunday, July 25th, or more importantly for us, it is the 16th of Av. Yesterday was the joyous day of Tu B'Av, and as I plugged in my earphones, I heard in the preamble some discussion about Tu B'Av and some of the wonderful rituals. Today we're here to study the Talmud, the entire Talmud, one page at a time, one line at a time. Presently studying Ch6, Shabbat, chapter 6, and we are on Samach Dalid Amud Beis. That would be 64B, and with Hashem's help, we'll be turning the page to 65A. We are on Friday and on Thursday, actually. On Friday I was AWOL, and I want to thank you all for your trust to return today. I got stuck at a routine appointment for my daughter that went overtime. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, and I should have in retrospect realized this too, that no appointment starts and finishes at the time. I should have considered that, but you live and learn. So, but now we're here to study the Talmud, and it was a Mishnah that brought a series of back to women's accessories. There's a little bit, if you notice, of back and forth. We talk about women's stuff, men's stuff, women's stuff, men's stuff. If we just had the text of the Mishnah to try to provide some evidence about the balance of accessories, we might get the impression that women maybe in the time of the Mishnah had more items of clothing than men. I'm not certain if that remains the case to this day, but I suspect as a panel of men, we can't have a conclusive and exhaustive survey, but I'm sure we'd have some interesting results that might find at least some continuity in this regards. So, but that's our Mishnah. And we're going to go back. We closed out yesterday, or on Thursday rather, talking about the wool cap and the peanachris, the wig, and the fact that the Mishnah says that it can be worn in a chatzar, but not in a public domain. And I then mentioned that it's quite possible, based on a study, a survey of the different commentaries, that this this peanachris is not quite the wig of today. And if you look how Rashi describes it, it's not certain that it's a wig to our extent. And there's some other matters to consider, but we'll leave it at that. Let's share the screen, and we're going to continue discussing this. And we're going to get a little bit of some Talmudic history. We're going to be introduced to some new people and discuss a topic that, again, as I said, I suspect is interesting to all of our esteemed Talmidei Chachamim on this shir, and so we'll get to it. Here we go.
Quick question
yes,
that I thought of last week, and about if a man is wearing a toupee,
yes,
does he have to put on a kippah to make a bracha?
That's an interesting question. I suspect it is possible they might not need to, and it would get into the subject of why we wear a kippah. There are a few different reasons for a kippah. There's the reason that we famously know, which is what the word yarmulke is, to remember there's something above us. There's also a notion of modesty. I know it's not how we understand the kippah, that if the head is typically covered, it should be covered. There's some other ideas. It's quite possible that one would not have to wear a kippah, but I suspect that even if it's possible that one might not need to, I think most kippah wearing people would wear a kippah on top of a toupee nonetheless. Certainly we want to show our in environments where we're comfortable and desire to project our Jewishness. I'm sure we'd like to wear a kippah there as well. So let this not be an exhaustive response. I'm sure there are different perspectives. But it's an interesting question.
Amen.
Here goes the Gemara. Our Mishnah taught that a woman may wear her sheitel, a wig, and her cap, her woolen cap, into a courtyard, meaning into a environment that's not a biblical Rishus Harabim. It's not a Rishus Harabim, but it would typically not
Carmelite, right?
A Carmelist, yes. So that's what the Mishnah says, that these two items may be worn into a chatzir, but not into a public domain. Amar Rav is going to throw a wrench into our understanding here. Kol she'asur chachamim latzis b'leishus harabim. Whenever the sages of the Mishnah prohibit a certain item to be worn to the public domain, asur latzis b'lechatzar. They practically said you oughtn't wear this item of clothing or accessory out of your home, even to a common courtyard, into your pool deck area, or into the park. All those things you should not do. That's what Rav says. Chutz mikavul pe'anachris, with one exception, or two exceptions. The two items of our Mishnah, the kavul and the pe'anachris, these hair accessories, they may be worn into a chutzner, into a courtyard, though not into the public domain. Let's take a peek at Rashi. Kol she'asur chachamim. Is Rashi telling us something about the entire Talmud, the entire Mishnah? It says, Bereish Pirkin. What it means is all the items of our Mishnah over here, there's a series of Mishnahs that talk about chutei tzemer, upishtim, totefes, strings of hair, highlights, totefes, and all the other items listed in our Mishnah that says you cannot wear them to the Rishus Harabim. According to Rav, asur latzeis lechatzer, they should even not be worn into a Carmelis, a semi-private or semi-public space. Rashi says, although certainly halachically, in essence, you should be allowed to wear it. The Torah is as we know, vessels may be carried or maybe used in a chutzner which is enclosed, although it's not entirely private, but you can carry stuff around. Because these items are garments, accessory, ornamental kinds of stuff, the Chazal are more strict than our common sense might dictate. Because if we become accustomed to wearing these items that you're not supposed to wear outside, into the courtyard, into these other areas where you're certainly biblically permitted, you'll become entirely used to wearing it, and you'll end up wearing it out into a public domain. And the only time that the Chachamim do not make this restriction is the pe'anachris and the kabul. You're allowed to go out, and the Gemara in a moment will explain why there should be any difference between these two items and all the other items on Mishnah. So just to recap, Rav says, although the essential decree, the essential gezeira of the Chachamim was, don't wear it in a public domain. Here, they've expanded that restriction to even be in a chutzner. The Gemara is going to explain, excuse me, one second, the Gemara is going to explain the reason in a moment. And the question that is immediately going to come up, and Doctor, I don't know if this is your question, but it's likely that this is your question, which is we don't do a gzeira. You can't make a decree to a decree. And here what's going on is the Chazal don't want you to wear it in a public domain. And the Rav at least is saying that you by extension cannot wear it even outside of your home. And why is that not considered a gzeira? So here I have an explanation that's it's not going to be entirely satisfactory, but at least it'll explain to us a little bit more about how ein goes in gzeira. What it means really, at least according to the explanation I have over here, is that the statement that the Chachamim can't make a decree to safeguard a decree means if there were two independent decrees. First, the Chachamim said, don't do X. And then 30 years later, the Chachamim noticed people weren't adhering to X. It doesn't have to be 30 years later. I'm just saying, and they made a gzeira. You know what? Don't go even into the chaser lest you end up carrying to the public domain. That would be a gzeira. What happened here, according to the Rav, according to the explanation that I have in my Gemara here, is that it was a single gezeira. In the moment that Chachamim said, we don't want you wearing certain items into the public domain, lest you come to take it off, maybe. They said, don't wear it in a public domain and don't even wear it in a chutzner. So the way Rav understands it, it was a single gezeira. Thematically, conceptually, there's two stages. There's a primary restriction and a secondary restriction. But if it was made in a single moment, the single gezeira that the Chachamim made, that would not technically qualify as a gzeira. Again, that explains us the technicality of it. I'm certain it doesn't fully resolve our discomfort with this extra stuff. Dr. Hammer, please.
the issue of an Eruv.
Yes.
There's no asterisk on any of these saying, but of course, if there's an Eruv, So why is that? Or am I just naive either to think that that it's there someplace else, or that they weren't at that time, it was not an issue because they didn't have in the public domain an Eruv.
So I'll tell you my impression. First of all, a chutzner likely was an Eruved space. A chutzner was an Eruved space. And so essentially what we're saying is maybe even not into the Eruv, you shouldn't wear certain things. Let this not be my final answer, but this is my sense here. And the restriction again, and it actually makes sense because today we have a common problem. I know when I'm in Brooklyn and certain parts of Brooklyn don't have Eruvs and other parts of Brooklyn have contentious discussions about the Eruvs. Or let's go to Manhattan, it's easier. There's many prominent poskim who feel that certain parts of Manhattan can't have an Eruv. Again, I'm not wading into that big debate now, but people from Israel, for example, that live in little yeshuvim or even big cities, practically are not aware of the fact that there's an issue of is there an Eruv or not? Because of course there's an Eruv. And so we actually understand some of the flaws of being so comfortable carrying and wearing and doing stuff in an Eruv, but you might end up, God forbid, inadvertently carrying even outside of an Eruv. So this actually, I think, helps us understand in an environment where your city might have not been an Eruv, but your courtyard was with an Eruv, and you could carry in the courtyard. The Chachamim still felt that certain items should not be worn, lest you forget that this item really shouldn't be worn at all. And why shouldn't it be worn at all? Because you might end up carrying it. Professor, please.
I think that this discussion implies the absence of Eruv in this place because they use the term public domain. Of course, they had Eruvim at that time. There is a Masechet Eruvim in the Talmud, so they all knew about Eruvim. But but when the roof is in place, then there is no public domain in this area, which is guarded by the roof, similar to the Chatzer.
Right, so that's what I'm saying. The Chatzer, I believe, is representative of an Eruv space. The question, the professor, I think that you're really bringing up is why didn't they? If they believed in the institution of the Eruv, why didn't they have more expansive Eruvs?
They just said public domain because when there is Eruv, there is no public domain.
And possibly when Jews lived in certain regions in Babylonia or Bavel or in Israel under Roman rule, it was not as simple as in America where all you need to do is hire Nat Lewin and spend a few $100,000 and you can get your Eruv anywhere.
Rabbi, not so simple even in Hallandale.
Indeed. So we had a Friday night dinner for young professionals. I don't know if you know this, but Hallandale and Hollywood, well, is having a constant influx of new people moving to town, and I'm sure there are certain parts of that influx that make you feel joyous, and other things that maybe make you feel uncomfortable. But the reality is that there's a growing population of people, young professional, young adults, from let's say 20 to 30 or 25 to 35, and of the past year, one of our new goals has been to attract that demographic and seek to bring some Yiddishkeit into their world. And Baruch Hashem, proud of the successes that we've had so far. And so on Friday night, we had a dinner in Shul for around 35 of such folks. And so towards the end, we were talking and someone asked about if there's an Eruv. And so I shared with him the Cliff Notes version of our story of our Eruv. And he's like, Rabbi, I'm a copyright attorney. You need to make sure to get that story sold for it sounds like a comedy, some kind of movie could be made out of the story. So I said at the time it wasn't comedy, it was very serious. But I guess the point is, I'm just thinking that, Professor, it was probably easier to make a chutzner, to make an Eruv in a chutzner, an area that was controlled by yourself and a few friends, but to get the whole city involved in an Eruv may have been harder. And I think there were less legal rights afforded then to the Jews then, although life wasn't so miserable for Jews in Bavel. They had a lot of autonomy for a while. But we're pretty blessed in America today too. May Hashem bless us that we continue to have those comforts and rights and blessings that America provides. So anyways, Professor, thank you for clarifying that. That's indeed my understanding. What's the difference between a chaser that's a private domain, a Yeshus Yachid, and your home that's a Yeshus Yachid? Very simple. In your home, it's only you and your loved ones and your family. And so when you got that brand new when you got that brand new piece of jewelry, you right away showed it to the members of your household. And so you're less likely to take it off at home. Once you're in a public domain, once you're in a place where there are other individuals beyond your direct household, it's already in that concept more like a public domain. Anyways, more to thought, but that's the basic, that's the gist of it. This is what Rav is saying. So again, Rav is the one who says that typically when the Chachamim prohibit wearing something into the public domain, they even mean into a chatzor. With the exception created for kaval and pe'anachos, this can. Now, not everybody agrees with Rav, and so we can take a deep sigh of relief, and this might explain why today there is at least a little less awareness of these matters. Rav Anani bar Sasson, Mishmei de Rabbi Yishmael Amar, Rabbi Anani, son of Sasson, the name of Rabbi Yishmael says, Hakol kikavul. All items that are prohibited in the public domain are permitted in a chaser. You can, if it's let's say if it's within the area or it's within a space that we're not worried about carrying, you can wear it there, even if you might take it off. And this might make a little more sense to us, or it's like easier for us to eat. And therefore we make the distinction between, let's say, a place that has an Eruv or a place that has a chaser and another kind of place. That's the opinion of Rabbi Anani bar Sasson. Now the interesting thing, and again, I don't have a photographic memory, and nor have I had an exhaustive list of all the names of the sages of the Gemara as I encounter them throughout the study of the Talmud, but this is certainly not a very common name to see Rabbi Anani bar Sasson. But we're going to see he was an important man. Let me just take a peek at Ch6 for a moment, and then. All right, maybe we'll go back to Ch6 in a moment. So anyways, you have this machlekes. Tanan. Now we're going to have the text of our Mishnah and see if it works with these two stated opinions. Rav saying only 2 items can be worn into a chaser. Rav Anani saying everything that's restricted in the public domain can be brought into a chaser. Tanan, let's take a look at our Mishnah. The kabul pe'anachos l'chaser. The Mishnah says, you know what? A kabul and a pe'anachos, these 2 head coverings, they can be worn into the courtyard. Bishlam Rav, according to Rav, who says these are 2 exceptions to the rule of how far the restriction extends, even into a chaser nicha. Our Mishnah reads seamlessly, fluidly, along with Rav's opinion. So Rav looks at the Mishnah and says, the Mishnah is saying my opinion. Elul Rav Anani bar Sasson kasha, we got a problem. How would Rav Anani bar Sasson make his point in the Mishnah? How could he defend his viewpoint against an explicit Mishnah that seems to disagree? So the Gemara says, hold on a second. You got to read that line a little slower. Rav Anani bar Sasson, who was he quoting? Mishmei deman ka'amarle, who was he quoting? Mishmei de Rabbi Yishmael bar Yosi. He wasn't making something up on his own. He wasn't stating his own opinion. He was quoting an opinion that was conveyed from Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosi. And you know what? Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosi, Tana hu upolik. He was from the Tanaic era. He was from the period of the Mishnah. And he has the authority and the weight to disagree with an opinion in the Mishnah without a problem. So Rabbi Anani bar Sasson, who was a sage of the Gemara, he would have to defend his position against a Mishnah which disagrees with him. But he wasn't stating his own opinion. He was coming with all of the weight and the gravitas of a Mishnah, of a sage of the Mishnah era, and therefore a Mishnah disagreeing with him is not enough to throw him off, and he can hold his own. So yes, this Mishnah does seem to reflect the viewpoint of Rav. But Adoni Bar Sasson was quoting a teaching from another sage of the Mishnaic era. The Rav Mishnah. Okay, so again, just to go back, I know we're going a little slow over here. The Mishnah teaches us different items that can't be worn out. The Mishnah says that two items that may not be worn into the public domain can be worn into the courtyard. Rav says, yeah, that's my point. Only those two items get an exception. And Rav Anani says, I don't agree. And just because the Mishnah is not accepting my statement, I don't care. I hang my hat on Rabbi Yossi, on Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, another sage of the Mishnah, a sage of the Mishnaic era, and therefore he's fine. He can hold his own. So the Gemara says, okay, we have two opinions, and we're not sure which one to follow, or Ch6 actually says that we should follow the opinion of Rabbi Nani to be more lenient and to allow all these items to be worn into a chatzir. That was the Ch6 that I peeked at and said maybe we'll do later, but suffice it to say Ch6 takes the more lenient approach. He doesn't take the approach of Rav. He doesn't take the approach that's expressed in our Mishnah. But now let's understand Rav. Why would Rav make a difference between different women's accessories, some that could be worn into the chatzir and some that can't? Here we go. Maishnahani. Why does Rav distinguish between the sheitel, the wig, and the woolen cap? Amar Ula says very simply, Kidei shaloi tisgana al baila. The sages do not want a woman to be so restricted in the accessories that she could wear that she might find herself unappealing to her husband. The Torah wants that a husband and wife should both appreciate and be enamored with each other and with their looks. And so Rab says we're willing to make some leeway to encourage and promote harmony, spousal harmony. Kiditanya, as the Brisa teaches, V'hadava b'nidasa. So the verse in the Torah describes the way in Jewish law a woman in her menstrual cycle and during menstruation is not allowed to be intimate with her husband, and there are certain other restrictions. So there was initially a misunderstanding of this text. Early folks used to think that that a woman, when she's during this phase where she's not allowed to be intimate with her husband, well, then she doesn't need to, she shouldn't make herself too attractive to her husband, so she shouldn't put on makeup. Hold on, let me just read the translation. I love to discuss this, Elaine, and I'm sure we have a lot to discuss here. She should not put on makeup, and she should not, let's see here. She should not put on other kinds of makeup, rouge and eye stuff. And she shouldn't put on classy, nice, attractive clothing. Rabbi Akiva set those people straight. And he said, what are you saying? Are you asking a woman to be unattractive to her husband? I know in today's day and age, probably what's getting everyone more nervous than anything is that a person should first and foremost be attractive to themselves and be comfortable themselves with how they appear. But suffice it to say, Rabbi Akiva here is concerned about the harmony of the home, and he doesn't want a person to feel insecure in their relationship. And therefore, he says that a person most certainly can make sure that they are attractive and presentable. And this verse, which certain people thought meant that they should be entirely unadorned, is actually just saying that a person remained ritually prohibited to the husband until they went to the mikvah. And this is based on one of the verses that describe the mitzvah of a woman going to the mikvah. Professor, I'm sorry for cutting off. Please go ahead.
Skeinim Harishanim, how are they different from Chachamim? Is it? I never encountered this term, and I wonder what kind of authority they had. Are these Tanaim? Probably not. What authority Rabbi Akiva had over them?
So, Professor, because of your question, my instinct over here is that we're not actually talking about people of halachic authority. We're talking about a prevailing sentiment, which therefore Rabbi Akiva was able to come around and set it straight. If they were an earlier halachic authority, Rabbi Akiva would have a harder time upending
Right.
and rejecting their opinion. My sense here is that this was a prevailing sentiment among folks. I'm sure not everybody agrees with this, but this is how I am. This is the sense that I'm picking up. So there's a certain prevailing sentiment, and Rabbi Akiva said, no, you guys are misreading the verse, and therefore adhering to a lifestyle that the Torah actually is not very comfortable. Now, there are different ways to understand this Gemara. So that's how I like to say it, because it's most comfortable for me to imagine that this was not a valid viewpoint within Jewish law. There are certain sages there are certain achronim, students of the Talmud, that see it a little differently. They say, listen, depending on how vulnerable a marriage is, would depend how much leeway you need to give to make sure that the marriage doesn't break up. And so a marriage that is very solid, or a system that's very resilient against divorce, I'm just telling you what some people say, I'm not asking you to like it, would be less uncomfortable if one spouse would be unattractive to the other. But if there is a very fragile relationship, well, then you want to really go out of your way to make sure that that relationship can endure by not introducing vulnerabilities and trauma or additional problems to the relationship. What does that have to do? Well, Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah, there's a Mishnah that discusses in the Tractate of Gittin that discusses what conditions must be met for a divorce to be initiated. And maybe you're familiar with this Mishnah, it's a famous Mishnah. And so there's Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva makes a very shocking statement. I have to see if I can remember. I believe he basically says that for anything at all, if a person wants to get a divorce, they can get a divorce. And so according to Rabbi Akiva, on halachic grounds, the marriage, the institution of marriage is very vulnerable in the sense that a person on a whim could decide to get a divorce. What do we call that in American law? Is there no fault or something like that? Where you don't have to actually give a, well, anyways, so because Rabbi Akiva is of the viewpoint that it's very halachically easy for a person to want to initiate a divorce, well, therefore, he says we should not create regulations or halacha that is not part of it, that is not biblical, that's going to introduce trauma and trouble to a marriage. Take it or leave it, but that's what I saw. Reb Barrow, go ahead.
Rabbi, to put it in historical perspective, I'm impressed at what people are considering. I would defy anybody to go back in religion and laws and see anything like that, any consideration at all for Shalom Bayis.
Well, Rabbi Akiva,
even Canada had the divorce that required adultery up until probably 40 years ago.
Interesting. Shkoyach for sharing that. Here, the Mishnah.
That's what
interesting. The footnotes. I don't know if do you remember this? We had a Gemara talking about the golden Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, or Ir Shel Zahav. You remember that? And so I looked into another Gemara that told the story about Rabbi Akiva told his wife, who was very poor as a young man when they got married. And he tells her, if I would have all the money in the world, I would buy you this Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, which was really an extravagant. I think it's the equivalent of what's the pink diamonds? You know that pink diamond? We're talking about many millions of dollars on an accessory. So Rabbi Akiva, I want to make sure I'm saying this in a very respectful way. It sounds like he was a little bit of a romantic, and he appreciated the relationship between a husband and wife. And particularly, he should appreciate, because we know that his wife had great mysterious nefesh to support his career. And the Gemara that we looked at says eventually he actually buys her this beautiful adornment when he has the economic means. And so on one hand, we said that Rabbi Akiva believes that a marriage could be very vulnerable, but I think really what he means is that a marriage should be so viable that it stands on its own 2 feet. A marriage shouldn't need a legal technicality to hold it together. A marriage should always flourish, ideally, by its own merit, not because there's a legal mechanism holding the marriage in place. That's just my added thought over here. So anyways, because the Chachamim are concerned about a woman feeling unattractive or being unattractive, they make license even though they were not really comfortable with it. However exactly that works and whatever exactly the framework of that is, the Chachamim didn't want to make a gzera that would push things into unhealthy territory. Period. That's the end of the discussion. So again, recap. I know we're going kind of slow over here, but I want to make sure we get it. There are two items in the Mishnah that may not be, we're afraid you're going to take it off in the public domain, so you can't wear it there, but you could wear it in a chatzir. According to Rav, that's the only two items that could be worn into a chatzir. Everything else cannot be worn at all. The Gemara asks why. The Gemara answers, because we want to make sure that we provide the woman the ability to be comfortable and adorn herself as she desires, or at the very least to provide her the bare minimum, which this was considered at that time a bare minimum. We're now going to see an interesting line, and this is what I believe it or not, what I said about that. We're going to find an interesting topic that everyone's going to have thoughts. I wasn't referring to this previous Gemara. I'm referring to this next line. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda teaches the name of Rav, and in a way you'll see it's a companion teaching to what we said before. Kol makom shasru chachamim mipnei maris ha'ayin. Whenever the chachamim said that a certain behavior, although fundamentally it's not a problem, but it gives the appearance of prohibition, it gives the appearance of a sin, and therefore it is prohibited. That act, which is prohibited only because of appearance, is restricted even if you're locked in a closet. If you're double locked, no one is home, and you go into a room without windows, into a closet, even though no one can see and you're certain of it. The restriction of the Chachamim extend even to such a scenario. But Steiner from prohibiting an action. The Chachamim do not distinguish between circumstances. They cast a somewhat broad net. They prohibit the act, period. Rashi. What is maris ayin? That a person should not be suspected of doing something prohibited. For example, certain items that a person shouldn't wear because of appearance. If you recall, long time ago, earlier on in the last chapter, we spoke about how a person, although they may lead certain animals on Shabbos, they shouldn't hold all of the camels' reins in one hand, because then it looks like you're heading to, or you shouldn't set them up, in a line, because then it looks like you're going to the market. And there were other items as well that we said principally they're okay, but the observer doesn't know that it's okay, and they think you're desecrating Shabbos, and therefore you cannot do it. So even if you're all alone in a deserted island or in a forest, you still should refrain from that. And so here we see that Rav is very big into extending the parameters of a gzera, or clarifying the extent of the parameters of the gzera. And so previously he says most items that are prohibited in the public domain are also prohibited in the chatzir. And in a similar but different sense, if you're not allowed to do something because of the appearance, you even can't do it if no one's going to see the appearance. The Gemara is going to take a Mishnah that seems to raise an objection. And Ch6 says there are those that are of the opinion that we should reject the opinion of Rab in this instance. But Ch6 seems to not be entirely comfortable in this instance. Ch6 seems to be more inclined to accept the opinion of this Gemara that, again, unless, aside for unique circumstances, one should not do something that is prohibited because of maris ayin, even in the privacy of their home. Because once the Chachamim prohibit it, they divorce the prohibition from the reason behind the prohibition. That is that. All right, let's just do a few more lines, and I want to be able to get to 65A, but we're going to go a few minutes early today. Tanan, are you certain about this? Says the Gemara. We have a Mishnah we learned. You're not allowed to have your animal go out with a bell, even if it's stuffed up. Tanya idach, but there is another brisa, excuse me, that says, that you are allowed to stuff up the bell and have it in a chaser. So what does it mean? It seems like, although the reason why you can't have the bell is because it appears like a problematic action, you can yet do it in your own courtyard. Why? Because the whole problem with the bell was that you're bringing it to the marketplace. If you're in your own courtyard, no one thinks you're taking it to the marketplace. You're in your own home. And yet, it's permitted, seeming to throw a wrench into the idea that you're not allowed to do something prohibited for Marasayin, even in your private domain or in a space where there is no Marasayin. The Gemara answers Tanai. It's actually a machlekes in the Mishnah. Some rabbis say it is always prohibited. Others say that it's not so. Tanya, person, says Rabbi Steinsaltz, has their clothing all wet and they need them to dry. You're allowed to spread them out, but don't do it where people can see. Why not? Because why usually is clothing on a clothesline? Not because it got wet, but because it was laundered. And laundry is prohibited on Shabbos. So Rashi, they shouldn't suspect that you did laundry on Shabbos. Hi Tana Savar. So this rabbi who says don't do it publicly, but privately it is okay, he seems to say that we're not afraid of Marasayin in a private setting. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, but the other two rabbis, Rabbi Shimon, say it's prohibited. So we have a machlekes here about if Marasayin extends even to where nobody can see. In general, the subject of Marasayin is interesting. And I know in our esteemed class, we've already had a number of questions raised about why are we so concerned about what someone else thinks. And right, I think the professor, Dr. Hammers asked that. And it's evident that the Chachamim are concerned about Marasayin. But the question of why is a good one.
Rabbi.
Yes.
This is sort of the controversy we have today, whether we could make non-kosher looking food. Having artificial bacon or whatever you want to call it. There's a pushback, probably based on this kind of guidance.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. In the laws of kashrus, it says that if someone is going to use a milk substitute, and they're going to have it along with meat, they should make sure that it's clear that it's a milk substitute. So if it's made out of soy, you should have a big chunk of soy sitting on the. Now today is probably a little different because today it is so prevalent that if you would go into a kosher restaurant and they serve you milk with your coffee, you'll know that it's non-dairy. Or if they serve you ice cream at dessert, you'll know that it's non-dairy. And if you find it otherwise, that would be a problem. So that's that. My dear friends, I think we're going to close out today with this. So again, today's Gemara, one subject really, or two. The question of do we always extend a prohibition to go to the public domain even in the courtyard or not? Is it Xer? The Xer, we said it isn't. What is the reason for these different opinions? Or how can there be two different opinions if the Mishnah takes a position? Or Rav Anani was not speaking for himself, he was speaking for a sage of the Mishnah. Then we talked about Marasayin. So a fairly simple, short Gemara. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy Sunday so we could study together. A big Yasher Koyach. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you tomorrow, the Ezer Hashem, for a full hour. And let me just add, I put it in the text, but I meant to mention there is a young Jewish man, hasn't come to shul, but I'm in touch with him, and unfortunately, it seems like he was beaten up. I'm not sure I'm still finding out the exact circumstances. And he's in ICU in a coma, and we'll daven for his refuah shlema, for his speedy healing. So it's Boris Ben Chaya. Boris Ben Chaya should have a speedy recovery, and only good news for Klal Yisrael.
Amen.
that.
Thank you. Thank you. Shikoya.
Bye, friends. Have a wonderful day. Again, hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Good, good.
Gosh.
You will.